They say no one ever returns after stepping through the ancient gate, but Seren never believed in warnings. Her hand tightened around the cold hilt of her sword as she stood before the massive stone gate where strange symbols glowed faintly in the darkness. The wind howled through the crumbling ruins, carrying whispers that seemed to echo from thousands of restless souls. "It's time," Seren murmured, her sharp gaze unwavering. Behind her, 3 warriors clad in silver cloaks stood silently. They were the last who still believed that the truth buried in this darkness was worth risking their lives for. Seren raised her sword, the tip touching the center of the gate. A surge of blue light flared, and the ancient symbols began to shift as if they were alive. The gate trembled, then slowly creaked open, revealing a void of absolute blackness. "There's no turning back," came the deep, cold voice of Aedric, the oldest of the Guardians. "I never intended to." Seren stepped across the threshold, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Inside, the world twisted like a nightmare. Pale, drifting souls hovered in the air, their empty eyes following every move. In the distance, a faint, flickering light beckoned, where the promise of truth awaited, or a deadly trap from which no one could escape. Seren stepped deeper into the darkness, each footfall echoing through the empty void. The air was so cold it numbed her skin, but she didn't stop. Behind her, the 3 warriors followed silently, each feeling the invisible weight pressing down on them. "They're watching us," Aedric murmured, his aged eyes scanning the drifting souls around them. "They fear our light," Seren replied, her sword glowing faintly in her hand. But she knew the truth. Fear alone wouldn't keep these spirits at bay for long. The group advanced into a narrow corridor, its stone walls carved with twisted, unnatural symbols. At the end of the corridor stood a silver-plated door, cold and foreboding. Across its surface, glowing in pale blue script, were the words, "To seek the truth, you must pay with your faith." Seren hesitated, her palm damp with sweat. She knew the warnings here were never idle threats. This place tested more than just strength. It tested the soul. "I'll open it," she said, not waiting for anyone's approval. As her hand touched the door, a surge of light engulfed them, pulling them into a different realm, a place where light and shadow swirled together like an endless storm. Before them stood a figure. He was tall, cloaked in tattered black robes, and his eyes burned crimson like twin embers from the abyss. Faith bearers, his voice was low and cold, each word heavy like iron. "You seek the truth, but is your faith strong enough to face it?" Seren raised her sword, her voice steady. "If a price must be paid, I will bear it." The figure let out a low, chilling laugh. "Every seeker pays a price, but not all survive the truth." The ground beneath them trembled. Visions flashed in the air, a city in flames, souls bound in chains, and a shadowed figure. The betrayer. Seren's breath caught. She knew him. Once the strongest among their order, he had vanished years ago. "You chose darkness," she said, her tone tense. "I didn't choose it," he replied, stepping closer. "I only saw the truth, and the light is not the only answer." Aedric tightened his grip on his sword. "If you stand in our way, we will not hold back." The figure laughed again, the sound reverberating through the void. "Then prove your faith is strong enough, but remember, truth always has a cost." Without hesitation, Seren charged forward, her sword blazing as it cut through the darkness, beginning a battle no one could foresee the end of. The clash was deafening. Seren's sword, blazing with silver light, struck against the betrayer's dark blade, sending sparks cascading into the void. The force of the impact rippled through the air, pushing both of them backward. But Seren did not falter. She lunged again, faster, her strikes precise and unyielding. "You still cling to your faith," the betrayer said, his voice calm despite the ferocity of the battle. "But faith alone won't save you here." "I'm not here to be saved." Seren growled, twisting her blade to deflect his next strike. "I'm here to end this." Behind her, Aedric and the other 2 warriors formed a defensive circle, their weapons glowing faintly as the drifting souls began to stir. The air grew heavier, and from the shadows, something else began to emerge. "Seren," Aedric warned. "He's not alone." She stole a glance, and her heart tightened. Figures wrapped in shadow, half human, half nightmare, crawled from the darkness. Their eyes burned with malice as they advanced, whispering in a language older than time. The betrayer smiled. "Truth awakens more than you're prepared to face. Are you willing to destroy yourself for it? Seren didn't answer. She shifted her stance, focusing all her energy into her sword. The light around her flared brighter, forcing the shadow creatures to hesitate. You lost yourself to this darkness, she said coldly. I will not. Aedric slashed through the nearest creature, yet his movements swift despite his years. We don't have time for words, he barked. End him before the gate closes. The betrayer's expression darkened. You think this ends with me? There are truths beyond what your fragile minds can bear. He raised his hand, and the ground beneath them fractured, revealing a black abyss. From within, a pulse of pure shadow erupted, consuming the light in its path. Seren grimaced, planting her feet firmly. She could feel the pull, as though something ancient and hungry stirred beneath them. If you won't step aside, her sword ignited in a burst of white flame, then I will burn this darkness away. She surged forward, cutting through the shadows, her blade meeting his again in a violent explosion of power. The light and dark clashed and twisted around them, as if reality itself was beginning to tear apart. In the chaos, a voice, faint but clear, echoed through Seren's mind. The truth lies deeper, but to reach it, you must sacrifice what you hold most dear. For the first time, doubt flickered in her heart. Was she truly ready to pay that price? The voice lingered in Seren's mind, cold and unwavering. What you hold most dear. The words gnawed at her thoughts, but there was no time for hesitation. The betrayer pressed forward, his blade wreathed in shadow, striking with the force of a storm. Seren parried, but the impact sent a jolt of pain through her arms. Each clash of their swords drained her strength, but she refused to fall. With every strike, her light grew brighter, as if her will alone kept the darkness from swallowing them whole. Behind her, Aedric fought fiercely, cutting down the shadowed figures as they swarmed. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, but his grip never wavered. We can't hold them forever, he shouted. The betrayer laughed softly, his voice like a blade against stone. You fight so desperately, but you still don't understand. The truth cannot be conquered. It consumes. Seren narrowed her eyes. The truth doesn't scare me. Then why do you tremble? He stepped closer, their blades locked in a blinding clash. In that instant, his voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. I know your fear. I know what you're hiding. A chill crept through her veins, he knew. Somehow, beneath all his darkness, he had seen the truth she had buried, the doubt she dared not name. You're wrong, she hissed, forcing him back with a surge of light. But the whisper clung to her thoughts, poisoning her resolve. A scream cut through the chaos. One of the warriors collapsed, a shadow blade piercing his side. Seren's heart pounded in her chest. They were losing ground. If she didn't end this now, they would all be swallowed by the void. Enough, she growled. Raising her sword high, she drew on the last of her strength. Light poured from her blade, burning brighter than the sun. I will not break. The betrayer's eyes flared crimson. Then let the truth shatter you. He struck with all his power, and Seren met him head on. The world trembled as light and shadow collided, exploding outward in a wave that shook the very foundations of the realm. For a breathless moment, everything was silent. When the light faded, Seren stood alone. The betrayer was gone. Only a blackened scar remained where he had stood. But the voice echoed still, cold and relentless. The truth lies deeper. You have only begun to see. Her knees weakened, but she did not fall. She could feel it, something beyond the darkness, still waiting. And she knew this was far from over. The silence felt heavy, too heavy. Seren's chest heaved as she tried to steady her breath, the aftershocks of the battle still coursing through her veins. Her sword, once blazing with light, dimmed to a faint glow. The air around her crackled with remnants of power, but the shadows, they were retreating. For now. Aedric limped toward her, blood streaking his armor. His face, hardened by years of war, betrayed a flicker of relief. You did it, he said, though his voice held no triumph, only exhaustion. Seren shook her head slowly. No, this isn't over. The blackened scar where the betrayer had stood still pulsed faintly, as though something deeper, more ancient, stirred beneath it. Whatever they had faced was only the beginning. A weak cough behind her made her spin around. The fallen warrior, Seren, was barely clinging to life, his hand pressed against the shadow wound in his side. Darkness curled around the edges of the injury, refusing to fade. I can't hold it back, he rasped, pain etched into every word. Seren knelt beside him, placing a hand over the wound. Her light flared once more, but the shadow resisted, writhing like a living thing. It wasn't just a wound, it was a mark, a curse. Aedric's jaw tightened. If we don't purge it, the shadow will consume him. I know, Seren said quietly. But the only way to cleanse such a curse would cost her something far greater than strength. She hesitated, just for a breath, before focusing her power. The light in her palm grew brighter, hotter, until it burned white. She pressed it against the wound, and a cry tore from Eren's lips as the shadow writhed and shrieked. The pain of the purge surged through both of them. Seren could feel it clawing at her mind, dragging her toward the void the betrayer had spoken of. The truth lies deeper. The voice echoed again, closer now. With one final push, the shadow shattered, dissolving into nothingness. Eren gasped, his breathing ragged but steady. Seren swayed, the last of her strength slipping away, but she stayed on her feet. You saved him, Aedric said, though his eyes held a question he did not voice. At what cost? Seren didn't answer. She turned her gaze to the blackened scar where faint tendrils of shadow still curled. Something beyond this place, beyond even the betrayer, was stirring. This was only a door, she murmured, and we barely survived opening it. Aedric's hand fell to his sword. Then what lies beyond? Seren met his gaze, her voice steady but cold. The truth. And if we keep going, there may be no coming back. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with a final glance at the broken battlefield, Seren turned and walked deeper into the darkness, toward whatever lay waiting beyond the veil. The darkness ahead felt heavier, alive. With each step Seren took, the air grew colder, as if unseen eyes watched her from every shadow. Yet she did not stop. Whatever lay beyond, she would face it. Aedric followed close behind, his sword still drawn. Eren, though pale and weak, forced himself to move. The curse burned from his veins, but leaving a scar that ran deeper than flesh. The third warrior, Lyra, walked silently, her face grim as she scanned the shifting void. The scar is still pulsing, Lyra muttered. Something's not right. If the betrayer is gone, why does the darkness linger? Seren didn't answer immediately. Her senses were on edge. Every fiber of her being screamed that something was wrong. The betrayer had been powerful, but not enough to fracture reality itself. Something else was at work. At the edge of the broken ground, they found another gate. This one was older, its surface cracked and worn, as if time itself struggled to erase its existence. Strange markings glowed faintly, symbols Seren did not recognize. Aedric frowned, his fingers brushing the ancient carvings. This isn't from our world. It's a seal, Seren whispered, not to keep something out, but to keep something in. Before anyone could react, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The scar at their backs flared to life, and a deep, hollow sound echoed through the void, a sound that chilled Seren's blood. The gate began to shift. The cracks spread wider, and from the fractures a golden light seeped through. But this light was cold, unnatural, and wrong. No, Aedric breathed. Something's breaking free. Seren stepped forward, raising her sword. The light in her blade pulsed again, but it felt fragile against the overwhelming force stirring beneath them. We can't let it escape, she said, her voice fierce. Whatever's behind this gate, it was locked away for a reason. The markings on the gate flared brighter, and in the space between the cracks, a shape began to form, a figure, tall and bound in golden chains. Its eyes, when they opened, burned like dying stars. You were warned, the figure spoke, its voice both ancient and broken. And yet you came. A wave of pressure crashed over them, forcing Eren to his knees. Lyra gasped as her blade trembled in her grip. But Seren stood firm, her heart pounding as the truth became clear. The betrayer had only been a servant. This was the master. You seek truth, the figure murmured, the chains straining against its rising power. But truth is no gift. It is a curse, and you have come too far to turn back. The gate shattered, and the true battle had only just begun. The gate shattered into nothingness. A wave of power ripped through the void, bending reality itself. Seren dug her heels into the fractured ground, her sword flaring with light as the force pushed against her. Aedric held firm beside her, while Lyra and Eren staggered back, their faces pale with shock. When the light faded, the figure stood free. It was no longer bound by golden chains. Its form was tall, ethereal, almost human, but too fluid, too vast. Dark robes coiled around it like living shadows, and its eyes burned like dying stars, cold and endless. "You have broken the seal," it said, its voice deep and hollow. "Do you understand what you have unleashed?" Seren raised her sword, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if the question amused it. "I am the one who saw beyond the veil, the first to touch the truth, and the first to fall beneath its weight." Aedric stepped forward, his voice tight. "Are you the one who commanded the betrayer?" The figure's eyes burned brighter. "The betrayer?" A faint laugh echoed through the void. "He was nothing but a fragment, a shadow of a greater truth. I am no master of his. I am what he feared." A cold knot tightened in Seren's stomach. This was worse than she had imagined. "What is it you want?" she demanded. The figure raised a hand, and the air trembled around them. "It is not what I want," it said softly. "It is what you seek, truth. But truth is no gift. It is a burden, and it is time you bore it." Without warning, the void shattered. Seren gasped as reality twisted around them. The battlefield was gone. In its place stood a city, a broken, dying city. Towering spires crumbled into dust, and the air itself burned with shimmering fractures. Frozen figures littered the streets, their faces twisted in eternal agony. Aedric's voice was low, shaken. "What is this place?" The first gazed out at the ruins. This was the last city to seek the truth. It burned when they saw too much. Seren's blood turned cold. And now, we're next. The air hung heavy with the weight of forgotten sorrow. Seren stepped forward, her boots echoing against the broken stone beneath her. Every corner of the ruined city seemed to whisper, a warning, a plea, but nothing living remained. Only shadows frozen in their final moments. Aedric followed closely, his knuckles white as he gripped his sword. "If this was the last city to seek the truth," he said quietly, "then what did they find?" The first stood still, its gaze fixed on the shattered sky above. "They found the edge of knowledge," it said. "And beyond that edge lies madness." A chill crept down Seren's spine. "You're saying the truth itself destroyed them?" "No." The first voice was softer now, almost mournful. What destroyed them was their inability to bear it. Truth is not a flame to be held. It is a fire that consumes. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Lyra knelt beside one of the frozen figures, a woman clutching a child. Their faces were twisted in terror, their forms half dissolved into shadow. "They never had a chance," she murmured. "Whatever came, it tore through them." A tremor shook the ground beneath them. From deep within the city, something stirred, something vast and ancient. The shadows along the edges of the ruins began to move, crawling like serpents toward the center. Seren's heart quickened. "We can't stay here. Whatever happened to them, it's not finished." The first turned toward her, those burning eyes locking onto hers. "You are closer than any before you," it said, "but every step comes with a price. Are you willing to pay it?" Seren's grip on her sword tightened. She thought of everything they had lost already, the warriors who had fallen, the blood they had shed. "We've come too far to turn back now," she said. "I'll pay whatever price is necessary." Aedric's voice cut through the heavy silence. "And if the price is your soul, Seren?" For a heartbeat, the question hung between them. But deep inside, she already knew her answer. "If that's the price to stop this darkness," she said, her voice steady, "then so be it." The first raised its hand, and the city trembled again. The ground cracked open, revealing a descending path of black stone spiraling into the heart of the ruins. "The final truth lies below," it said. "But know this, once you cross that threshold, there is no return." Without hesitation, Seren stepped forward. "Then we go together." And with that, she led them into the darkness below, where the truth and their fate awaited. The descent was steep and unyielding. Each step echoed through the darkness, a hollow sound that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the weight of the forgotten truth pressed down on them with every breath. Seren led the way, her sword casting a pale, flickering light that barely pierced the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear take hold. Whatever awaited them below, she would face it. She had to. Behind her, Aedric moved in silence, but the tension in his voice earlier still hung between them. She knew he was afraid, not for himself, but for her. "Seren," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. "I meant what I said. If the price is too high, I know, she interrupted, not turning back, but some things are worth the cost. He didn't answer, but she felt his presence, steady, unwavering, just as it had always been. And for a brief moment, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. Eren's breathing was rough, strained. The wound the shadow left on him still lingered beneath the surface, but he pushed forward, refusing to let his pain slow them down. Lyra stayed close to him, her expression guarded. Yet in her eyes, Seren saw something else. Fear! Not of the darkness around them, but of what they might become by the time this was over. The path finally leveled out, opening into a vast chamber. The air thrummed with an ancient, pulsing energy, both alive and hungry. In the center stood an altar, black as obsidian, covered in symbols that shimmered with a faint golden light. But it was what hung above the altar that made Seren's breath catch in her throat. A heart suspended in midair. Not flesh, not stone, but something else entirely. It glowed softly, as though it still beat with the memory of life. Threads of shadow coiled around it, fighting against the light it emitted. The heart of the first said, stepping beside her. There was no triumph in its voice, only a deep, lingering sadness. The source of all knowledge, all truth. It was sealed here, to protect your world from what lies beyond. A chill crawled up Seren's spine. And if it breaks? The first's gaze burned into her. The veil will fall, and the truths no mortal was meant to know will consume everything. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. This was not just a battle of light and shadow. It was something far greater, and the cost of failure was unthinkable. Aedric stepped closer, his voice low and fierce. What do we do? Seren swallowed hard, forcing the fear aside. There was no turning back now. We finish this, she said, and with that she stepped toward the altar, toward the heart of the truth itself. As Seren approached the altar, the pulsing energy grew stronger, like a heartbeat echoing through the void. Each step felt heavier, as though the truth itself resisted her presence. The closer she came, the more the shadows around the heart writhed, sensing her intent. Aedric's hand hovered near her shoulder, but he didn't stop her. He knew this was her burden to bear. Lyra and Eren held back, watching with tense, unreadable expressions. Even the first remained still, as if what came next was beyond its power to control. The heart called to her. A whisper slid through her mind, soft, inviting, dangerous. It promised understanding, power beyond imagining, an end to the endless struggle. And beneath the promise lay something darker, a warning. Seren's breath quickened, but she refused to break stride. She had come too far to falter now. If this heart held the key to stopping the spreading darkness, she would claim it, no matter the cost. As she stretched out her hand, the shadows struck. They lashed toward her like serpents, cold and sharp as daggers. She raised her sword just in time, the blade blazing with light as it sliced through the darkness. But for every shadow she cut down, more surged forward. They weren't just defending the heart, they were protecting something else. Aedric lunged beside her, his blade flashing as he cut a path through the swirling tendrils. "They're getting stronger," he growled. "If we don't move now—" "I know," Seren snapped, her jaw clenched. The pressure around her grew heavier, as if the very air sought to crush her beneath its weight. But she would not stop. She couldn't. Her fingertips brushed the heart. A shockwave blasted through the chamber, knocking everyone to the ground. The world around her twisted. No longer the ruined city, no longer the endless void. For a moment, she was somewhere else. She stood in a great hall of light, endless and blinding. Figures loomed before her, tall and radiant, their faces hidden behind veils of gold. And in the center of them all, a figure knelt, broken, chained. The first. "You do not understand," a voice boomed through her mind. "This heart is not a weapon. It is a prison, and if you take it, you will set us free." Seren gasped, her vision snapping back to reality. Her hand trembled above the heart, her mind reeling. "What did you see?" Aedric demanded, his voice edged with fear. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't sealing away the darkness," she said. "They were sealing themselves away." And now, the prison was breaking. Light exploded from the heart, flooding every corner of the chamber. Seren gasped as the power surged through her veins, a searing, relentless force that felt both ancient and alive. The world around her blurred, distant voices fading into a hollow, ringing silence. She felt the heart's weight, not just its power, but its purpose. It was more than a prison. It was a seal against something far greater and far more terrifying. Aedric's voice cut through the light. Seren! His hand reached for her, but the force holding the heart pulled her deeper, away from him, away from everything. She clung to his voice, her heart aching with every beat. But the path she had chosen was already closing behind her. The first stepped forward, its gaze heavy with something that almost resembled sorrow. It is done, it said softly. The heart has chosen its new guardian. Seren's fingers trembled as the last of the shadows shattered around her, dissolving into nothingness. The power binding her grew stronger, too strong. It wasn't just anchoring her to the heart, it was changing her. The light faded, and when her vision cleared, the chamber was different. No more broken stone, no more creeping shadows, only an endless expanse of silver light stretching beyond the edges of reality. She was inside the prison now, bound to its eternal purpose. Aedric stood at the edge of the light, his face pale, his eyes burning with anguish. Come back, he pleaded, stepping closer. We'll find another way. Just come back. Seren's heart twisted. She wanted to reach for him, to take his hand and leave this place behind. But the chains of the heart were already wrapping around her soul, pulling her deeper. There was no going back. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to smile, soft, aching. You have to live, she said. Promise me. Aedric shook his head, his voice breaking. Not without you. Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him everything she never had the chance to say. How much he meant to her. How in another life she would have chosen him. Always. But there was no time. The light flared again, and the prison walls began to close. I love you, she whispered. And then the gate sealed shut. Aedric fell to his knees, his fists clenched as the last glimmer of light faded from the chamber. She was gone, lost to the heart's eternal burden. But somewhere in the distant glow, Seren remained, a guardian against the darkness, bound forever to protect the world she loved. Aedric knelt in the empty chamber, the silence pressing against his chest like a weight he could not bear. The warmth of Seren's presence was gone, replaced by a cold, aching void that no sword or battle could ever mend. His hands trembled as he touched the place where she had stood, where the light had swallowed her whole. It felt impossibly quiet, as if the world itself mourned her loss. Behind him, Lyra and Eren stood in stunned silence. Neither spoke. There were no words for what had just happened, for what she had sacrificed. She's really gone, Lyra's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Aedric clenched his jaw, fighting the tears burning behind his eyes. He had always believed there was nothing they couldn't face together, but this was beyond him. She's not gone, he said, his voice rough. Not completely. Eren stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. The heart took her, Aedric. She's a part of it now. There's no way to bring her back. Aedric shook his head. No, I refuse to accept that. His hand tightened into a fist. If there's a prison, then there's a door. If there's a door, we can find a way to open it, Lyra finished softly, hope flickering in her voice. The first remained silent, watching them with those burning, unreadable eyes. But as Aedric turned to face it, something inside him ignited, a fierce, unyielding resolve. You knew this would happen, he said coldly. You knew the heart would take her. The first inclined its head. The heart requires a guardian. Without her, the prison would fail, and your world would burn. Aedric's breath trembled with fury. And what if I refuse to leave her there? What if I break your prison and tear her free? The air around them grew heavy, the distant light of the heart faintly pulsing beneath the stone. The first's voice, when it came, was like distant thunder. If you open the prison, you risk unleashing what lies beyond. It is not a burden meant for mortals. Aedric's eyes burned with fierce determination. I don't care what it takes. He stood, his sword gleaming in the fading light. I will find her. I will bring her back, even if I have to tear through every shadow in this cursed place. A long silence stretched between them, and then the faintest hint of a smile touched the first's lips. Perhaps, it said, your story is not finished after all. Without another word, Aedric turned toward the broken path that had led them here, his heart heavy, but his purpose clear. He would not stop, not until he brought Seren home. The broken path stretched before Aedric, jagged and endless, but he did not hesitate. Each step echoed in the empty chamber, his heart pounding with fierce, unwavering resolve. If the heart thought it could take Seren from him, it was wrong. Behind him, Lyra and Eren followed, their footsteps quiet but determined. No one spoke, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy between them, an unspoken promise that this was far from over. As they reached the outer edge of the chamber, Lyra broke the silence. If you're serious about finding her, where do we even begin? Aedric's grip tightened on his sword. The heart is a prison, he said, his voice cold and steady. But no prison is perfect. There has to be a crack, somewhere. Eren let out a slow breath, his face pale with exhaustion. And if there isn't? Aedric turned to face him, his eyes blazing with conviction. Then I'll make one. A sharp gust of wind swept through the chamber, carrying with it a distant whisper, a voice faint and fragile, like a thread of light in the dark. Aedric! His heart clenched. It was her. You heard that, right? He demanded, scanning their faces. Lyra nodded slowly. It's faint, but it's her. She's still there. The first stepped forward, its presence radiating ancient power. A connection remains, it said, its voice low. Her soul lingers on the edge of the veil, but such bonds are dangerous. If you pull too hard, you risk unraveling what holds the prison intact. Aedric's jaw clenched. I don't care about your prison. The first tilted its head. And yet if it falls, your world will burn. Would you doom everything for one soul? He didn't even pause. Yes. A flicker of something, respect, crossed the first's face. Then you must seek the Echo Gate. It is the only place where the veil between worlds is thin enough to cross. Lyra frowned. The Echo Gate is a myth. No one's ever found it. Aedric turned back toward the shadowed ruins beyond the chamber, his shoulders rigid with determination. Then we find it. Without waiting for a response, he started forward, into the dark unknown. His soul burned with a single truth. He would not leave her behind. And no power, no prison would stop him. The ruins stretched endlessly before them, twisted stone and broken pillars swallowed by the dark. The air grew colder as Aedric pressed forward, each step a silent vow. If the Echo Gate was their only path to Seren, he would tear the world apart to find it. Lyra and Eren followed closely, their weapons drawn, senses sharpened. The echo of Seren's voice still lingered, a fragile thread in the back of Aedric's mind. It was faint, but it was real. And as long as he could still hear her, he would never stop. The first said the Echo Gate touches the veil, Lyra murmured, scanning the jagged horizon. If that's true, it must be connected to the oldest places, the ones where reality is weakest. Aedric's gaze darkened. The forgotten depths, he said, the words like a blade on his tongue. Eren's steps faltered. That place is cursed, he warned. No one who's entered it has ever returned. Aedric didn't slow. Then they weren't strong enough. A tense silence hung between them as they moved deeper into the ruins. The shadows grew heavier, pressing against their minds, their breaths curling in the frigid air. Yet beneath the weight of the dark, that faint whisper, Seren remained. Suddenly, Lyra froze, her hand shooting up in warning. Something's here, she whispered. Aedric unsheathed his blade, the steel glinting cold and sharp. A moment later, the ground trembled, a low, crawling vibration that made the air hum. From the darkness, figures emerged. Not shadows, something worse. Pale, hollow-eyed sentinels, their forms twisted by the prison's ancient magic. Once guardians, now hunters. They're bound to the heart, Eren hissed. If they sense us. One of the sentinels turned its hollow gaze toward them, and Aedric felt the air shift, an unnatural chill that crawled under his skin. It knew. Too late, he growled. The first sentinel lunged, claws gleaming black as night. Aedric met it head on, his sword blazing as it cut through the air. Sparks flew as steel clashed against shadowed bone. Lyra's daggers flashed beside him, quick and precise, while Eren's spear swept wide, driving back the others. But for every sentinel they struck down, more came, drawn by the trace of Seren's soul still lingering between worlds. We can't fight them all, Lyra gasped, her breath ragged. Aedric's heart pounded as he cut another down. We don't need to fight, he said. We just need to find the gate. The whisper of Seren's voice brushed his mind again, fainter now, as if the prison itself was pulling her deeper. And if they didn't reach her soon, they would lose her forever. Aedric pushed forward, his sword a blur of steel and fury. Each strike cut through the sentinels, but they kept coming. endless and relentless, as if the prison itself refused to let them go. Behind him, Lyra spun in a deadly dance, her blades flashing with silver light. "We're being cornered," she shouted, her voice tight with strain. Eren drove his spear into the chest of a towering sentinel, the force sending a tremor through his arms. "We can't hold this line much longer." Aedric's jaw clenched. He knew they were outnumbered, but stopping wasn't an option. Not while Seren's voice still called to him. Not while she was still out there, waiting. The faint echo of her presence trembled in his mind, weaker with each passing breath. "Hold on, Seren, I'm coming." A sudden shift in the air made him freeze. Something deeper, older, was stirring beneath the ruins. The ground trembled underfoot, and from the darkness ahead a cold, pale light flickered. "The gate," he said, his voice raw with urgency. "It's close. I can feel it." Lyra's eyes narrowed, scanning the ruins. "Then we cut our way through." Without waiting, Aedric surged forward, carving a path toward the pale light. The sentinels swarmed, but his blade burned brighter, fueled by the fierce, unyielding need to reach her. As he fought, something else stirred inside him, a power he barely understood. When Seren took the heart, it had changed her. But the bond between them had never broken, and now it was awakening. The light ahead pulsed again, stronger, brighter. The Echo Gate. He knew it, felt it in his bones, but the sentinels felt it too. A deafening shriek tore through the air as the largest of the creatures emerged from the shadows. Twice his height, its form was jagged and broken, glowing with the same pale energy as the gate. Its hollow eyes fixed on Aedric, and it charged. Aedric barely raised his sword in time. The impact knocked him backward, pain flaring through his shoulder. But he didn't fall. He couldn't. "Eren, take the left," he barked. "Lyra with me." They moved as one, striking fast and hard. Eren's spear pierced the creature's side, while Lyra's dagger sliced deep into the joints. Still, it did not fall. Aedric felt the pulse of the gate behind him, so close, but the Guardian blocked their path. And time was running out. A roar ripped from his chest as he raised his sword, channeling the power rising within him. Light flared along the blade, brighter than it ever had before. With a final, savage strike, he drove the sword through the creature's core. The Guardian let out a shuddering wail as cracks spread across its form. Light poured from within, until at last it shattered. The path to the Echo Gate lay open. Aedric didn't hesitate. "Go," he commanded, his heart pounding. Because on the other side of that gate, Seren was waiting.